It was a cold morning in Fairview, a small town where time seemed to stand still. Margaret Whitmore, a 78-year-old woman, had lived alone in a modest home since her husband passed away nearly 2 decades ago. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, she came across something that would change her routine. A German shepherd, thin, with dirty fur and an exhausted look. He was lying near a trash can, shivering from the cold. Margaret hesitated for a moment, but her kind heart wouldn't let her walk away without helping him. "Come here, big guy." "I can't leave you here," Margaret said, cautiously reaching out her hand. To her surprise, the dog approached without fear, as if he understood that this woman was his chance to survive. She took him home, gave him a bath, food, and a blanket to rest. For days, he remained quiet, but his eyes spoke of something deep, as if he was hiding a story she couldn't quite understand. Margaret named him Max, a simple name for a companion who would soon become essential in her life. As Max recovered, Margaret began noticing some intriguing behaviors. He seemed to understand commands like sit or stay without her ever teaching them. When she dropped a metal object, he picked it up with precision and placed it back in her hands. "You must have been well trained," she commented, petting his head. Despite all of this, Margaret never questioned the dog's past. To her, he was simply a miracle that arrived at the right time to fill the emptiness in her life. While Margaret was forming a special bond with Max, 2 men were watching her house from a car parked across the street. Pete and Danny, known for small thefts in the area, saw Margaret as an easy target. "She lives alone. She's probably keeping money or something valuable inside," Pete commented, while Danny nodded with a sly smile. They had no idea that the elderly woman had a protector with skills far beyond what they could imagine. That night, while Margaret was reading a book in the living room, Max lay beside her, alert to every sound. He seemed to always be on high alert, as if he could sense danger before it even happened. Margaret, unaware, was stroking his soft fur, amused by the dog's devotion. Little did she know fate was about to test that bond in a terrifying way. Night had fallen over Fairview, bringing with it a silence broken only by the occasional sound of leaves blown by the wind. Inside Margaret's house, Max lay at the feet of the elderly woman, but even with his eyes half closed, his ears were alert. Outside, Pete and Danny were hiding behind a nearby bush, watching the lights in the living room go out. "The old woman must be asleep by now," Pete whispered, a confident smile on his face. Danny adjusted the makeshift mask he was wearing. "We go in, grab whatever we can, and get out fast." Simple. The 2 men moved around the side of the house, where a low window invited them to break in. Pete used a tool to force the lock while Danny kept a wary eye on their surroundings. Inside, Max perked up his ears. The sound of metal scraping set his instincts into motion. Without making a sound, he got up and moved into the hallway, where he could keep an eye on both the living room and the house's entrance. Margaret was sleeping deeply in the armchair, unaware of what was about to happen. Pete managed to open the window, and both of them slipped in quietly. With small flashlights, they began rummaging through drawers and furniture in search of anything valuable. "Hurry, grab anything that shines," Pete said as Danny found a small box with a few old pieces of jewelry. The job seemed easy, and they were convinced no one would disturb them. What they didn't know was that Max was already aware of their presence, watching them from a dark corner of the room. Suddenly, the sound of a deep growl echoed through the room, cutting the silence like a knife. Pete froze, and Danny quickly turned his head toward the direction of the sound. "What was that?" Danny whispered, his voice trembling. Max stepped out of the shadows, his eyes glowing in the lantern light. He was growling quietly, every muscle tense, as if ready to attack at any moment. "It's just a dog," Pete murmured, trying to sound confident, but his voice betrayed his fear. "Get him away." When Danny took a step forward to intimidate Max, the German shepherd lunged like lightning. He grabbed Danny's pant leg, knocking him down with ease. Pete tried to react, but Max growled so loudly that the man hesitated. "Get off me!" Danny yelled, struggling to break free. But Max kept his grip, showing he wasn't an ordinary dog. Desperate, Pete grabbed a chair and tried to use it to push the dog away, but Max dodged with agility, never losing control of the situation. Margaret woke up startled by the screams. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice shaking as she turned on the room light. Upon seeing the two men on the floor and Max in control, she quickly understood what was happening. "Thieves," she murmured, feeling a mix of fear and indignation. Max, realizing his owner was awake and safe, released Danny but continued growling, blocking any attempt to escape. Pete grabbed his friend by the arm and shouted, "Let's get out of here!" With effort, they escaped through the window they had entered, leaving behind their failed plan and the fear of returning. The next morning brought a sense of unease to Margaret. As the sun lit up the small room, she watched Max, who still seemed on high alert, sitting by the window like a sentinel. The signs of the previous night were everywhere. Open drawers, objects scattered on the floor, and the back window still half open. Margaret sighed, stroking Max's fur. "You saved me, boy. But who are you really?" she murmured, more to herself than to the dog, determined to understand more about the animal who seemed to have extraordinary abilities. Margaret did something she had never done before. She took Max to the town's veterinarian, Dr. Stevens, hoping for some answers. In the office, as the vet examined the German Shepherd, he frowned when he noticed something unusual. "Margaret, he has a microchip. Would you like me to scan it to see where he's from?" he asked. Margaret hesitated for a moment, but she knew she needed to know more. "Please go ahead," she replied. What the microchip revealed left Margaret stunned. The vet looked at the monitor and said, "Max isn't just any dog. He used to belong to a police unit here in the area. According to the records, he was partnered with an officer named Jack Turner, but he went missing during an operation a year ago. It seems they thought he was dead." Margaret looked at Max, surprised. "You were a hero before you showed up on my porch?" she whispered, feeling a new wave of admiration for the dog. Without wasting any time, Dr. Stevens contacted Jack Turner, Max's former partner. Just a few hours later, Jack arrived at the office, looking stunned. He was a tall man with gray hair and a strong build, but his eyes were filled with emotion as he saw Mac. "I can't believe it. This is Max," Jack said, kneeling down to pet the dog. Max, who had been on alert until then, wagged his tail and licked the man's hand, as if he recognized him. Jack explained everything to Margaret as the three of them sat in the office. Max had been trained for special operations, including drug detection and rescue missions. During a mission, the car he was in crashed, and everyone assumed Max had died. "He must have survived and wandered until he found you," Jack said. "This dog isn't just a companion. He was trained to protect and serve, and it looks like he's still doing that." Margaret felt a mix of relief and concern. Knowing that Max had such a complex past explained his intelligence and behavior, but it also raised a new question. Did the men who invaded her house know what they were up against? "Jack," she said, her voice worried, "what if they come back?" Jack looked at Max, then at Margaret, his expression serious. "If they come back, they won't just have Max to deal with. I'll make sure you and him are protected." After the emotional reunion with Jack Turner, Margaret felt a strange mix of safety and unease. She knew Max was special, but she also knew the danger was still lurking. The thieves could come back, maybe with more courage or better preparation. Jack, sensing her worry, insisted on walking her home. "I'm not leaving you alone tonight," he said, holding tightly to Max's leash, which seemed to understand every word. At her house, Jack began inspecting the place. "This back window needs a stronger lock," he commented, pointing to the spot where the thieves had entered. Margaret, sitting in the armchair, looked at him with gratitude. "I didn't expect such kindness, Jack. You don't even know me." He smiled gently. "Margaret, anyone who gave Max a second chance deserves this and much more." As they worked to reinforce the house's security, Max followed them, alert to every sound around him. Meanwhile, Pete and Danny were in an abandoned warehouse on the other side of town, discussing what went wrong. "It was just an old lady's house. How did that dog take us down?" Danny asked, massaging his ankle that Max had injured. Pete, more frustrated than ever, slammed his fist on the rusty table. "I'm not letting this slide. If we go back with more people, that dog won't stand a chance." They decided to gather 2 more associates and return to finish what they had started. That same night, Jack realized that something bigger might be approaching. He set up a sort of trap with Max's help. "If they try to come in again, we'll know," he said, while attaching thin wires connected to makeshift bells at the entrances of the house. He also positioned simple security cameras he had brought with him, something Margaret found a bit excessive. "Jack, isn't this a bit much for an old lady like me?" she asked. He replied firmly, "Margaret, it's not just about you. Max is a threat to them now, and they might want to eliminate him." Night fell, and the house seemed surrounded by a tense silence. Margaret tried to read, but Jack sitting by the front door and Max patrolling the hallway didn't let her relax. "You know," Margaret began, trying to ease the tension, "I never thought my peaceful life could turn into a battlefield. It feels like something out of a movie." Jack chuckled softly. "Sometimes a peaceful life is the biggest target. It's where the unexpected likes to strike." Outside, Pete and his cohorts were already positioned, waiting for the right moment to strike. They believed the elderly woman would be sleeping again, unaware that this time there was surveillance in place. Max, who had been resting at Margaret's feet, suddenly lifted his head. He heard something. Jack noticed the dog's behavior and placed his hand on the holster of his gun. "They're here," he murmured. Margaret felt her heart race as Max took his position. The second battle was about to begin. The tension inside the house was almost tangible. Max stood motionless, like a statue, ears perked and eyes fixed on the direction of the back window. Jack held the gun, not drawing it from its holster, staying alert to the slightest sound. Margaret, sitting in the armchair, watched everything with her heart racing. "Jack, what do we do now?" she whispered. "We wait," he replied calmly, "and we trust Mac." Outside, Pete led the group. He signaled for the other 2 men to position themselves at different entrances of the house. Danny, still limping slightly, murmured, "This is crazy, Pete. That dog nearly tore me apart last time." Pete shot him an angry look. "This time we're ready. We get in, take care of the dog, and grab everything we can." They started to move silently, trying to avoid any alarms or reactions. However, Max was already 1 step ahead. When the first thief tried to force the back window, a faint clink echoed through the house. Jack's makeshift wire had worked. Max growled, a low sound, but filled with threat, and ran toward the noise. "Margaret, stay here," Jack said, quickly getting up and following the dog. He positioned himself near the kitchen, where he saw the window being pushed open. The dog positioned himself near the kitchen, where he saw the window being pushed open. Pete, realizing that the element of surprise had been lost, made a risky decision. He pushed the window harder, jumping inside with a flashlight in hand. "I warned you," Jack murmured, pulling out his gun and aiming it. "Get out of here now." Pete froze for a moment but then grinned cynically. "You're not going to shoot me. This is just a warning to scare me." Before Jack could respond, Max leaped forward, hitting Pete with enough force to knock him down. The flashlight fell to the floor, casting light on the thief's expression of pure terror. Meanwhile, the other 2 accomplices were trying to force the front door, but struggled with the reinforced lock. Danny, outside, heard Pete's screams and hesitated. "Maybe we should run," he suggested. But the third thief, more determined, pushed the door hard, breaking it open. "It's too late to turn back now," he said as he entered. However, as soon as they stepped into the house, they were met by Max, who was now patrolling frantically among the intruders. Chaos took over the place. Max, trained to protect and incapacitate threats, attacked with precision, while Jack covered the remaining entrances. Margaret, despite her fear, remained firm, holding the phone and ready to call the police. When the third thief tried to move toward the living room, Max blocked his path, knocking him down with a precise blow. "This isn't going to end well for you," Jack said coldly. And for the first time, Pete realized he might have underestimated both the elderly woman and her extraordinary dog. The tension in the room reached its peak. Max, with his imposing stance and eyes locked on the intruders, seemed invincible. Pete, lying on the floor, was trying to get back on his feet while Jack kept his gun aimed at him. "I told you to get out of here," Jack warned again, his voice low and threatening. On the other side of the room, the other two thieves appeared uncertain. Max's presence, now moving among them like a predator, kept them frozen in place. Pete finally got up, holding the arm Max had struck. "You think you can intimidate us with just that dog and a gun?" he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice was shaking. Jack took a step forward. "I don't need to intimidate. You've already lost. The police are on their way." It was a lie, but it was enough to make Danny's eyes widen. "What?" "He called the police," he whispered to his partner, who was now beginning to hesitate. Meanwhile, Margaret, hidden behind a door in the hallway, watched the events unfold. She held the phone tightly, ready to dial the emergency number, but decided to trust Jack and Max for a few more minutes. Her heart raced with every movement of Max, who was positioning himself strategically to protect the house and block the escape routes. "You'll never leave this house without paying for what you did," Margaret muttered to herself, finding an unexpected courage. Pete, realizing he was at a disadvantage, decided to act impulsively. He charged at Jack, trying to disarm him. However, Max reacted faster. With a precise leap, he grabbed Pete's leg and knocked him down again, making him scream in pain. Danny, terrified, took a step back and tripped over a chair, crashing to the floor with a loud thud. The third thief tried to move along the side of the room, but Jack spun around, aiming his gun directly at him. "I won't repeat myself." "Get out now," Jack said, his voice firmer than ever. The confusion escalated when one of the thieves attempted to escape through the back window. Max, however, was already there, growling and blocking the way. Pete, now completely defeated, began to beg. "Please, man, just let me go. We don't need any trouble." Jack didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of silence hang in the air. He then looked at Margaret, who had stepped out from the hallway and was now standing next to him. "Do you think we should let them go, Margaret?" he asked. Margaret, with a serious expression, looked at the men lying on the floor and at Max, who was waiting for further orders. "No," she replied firmly. "They broke into my house and put our lives at risk. They need to face the consequences." Jack nodded in agreement and asked Margaret to call the police. As the sound of sirens drew nearer, Pete and his accomplices realized they had lost. Max, with his imposing presence, stood guard, ensuring that no one would escape before justice arrived. Leave your comment below and tell us your expectations for what comes next. Will Max and Margaret finally find peace? Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends who also love thrilling stories like this. And of course, subscribe to the channel to keep up with everything firsthand. The red and blue lights illuminated the quiet street of Fairview, breaking the silence of the early morning. Two police cars parked in front of Margaret's house, while curious neighbors peered through their windows. Jack slowly opened the door, keeping the thieves under watch. Max, standing next to him, remained still but alert, ready to react to any attempt to escape. Pete, Danny, and the third accomplice were huddled in the corner of the room, their faces filled with defeat and fear. The first officer to enter was Sergeant Miller, a robust and experienced man known for his firm stance. "Jack Turner? What's going on here?" he asked, clearly surprised to see his former colleague in uniform. These three broke into Margaret's house. They were armed with burglary tools, but luckily, Max and I managed to hold them off, Jack explained. The sergeant glanced at Max, who seemed to almost understand that his presence was crucial. The officers handcuffed the thieves one by one. Danny tried to argue. "It was a misunderstanding. We didn't want to hurt anyone," he said, but the sergeant simply rolled his eyes. "Tell that to the judge," he replied coldly, pushing Danny toward the patrol car. Pete, still with his pants torn and marks from Max's teeth, glared at the dog with pure hatred. "That thing's a monster," he muttered, but none of the others seemed to agree with him. As the thieves were taken away, Margaret finally relaxed. Sitting in her favorite armchair, she sighed, feeling the weight of the tension melt away. Jack sat next to her with Max lying at their feet. "You were amazing, Margaret," Jack said, smiling at the lady. "You were the one who kept calm and let Max do what he does best." She stroked the dog's head and smiled gently. "I never thought I'd be so grateful to have found this lost dog on my porch." Outside, Sergeant Miller approached Jack before leaving. "I didn't know you were so involved in this, but it looks like you're still the same. Always protecting people." Jack shrugged. "I just did what needed to be done. And Max, he deserves the credit. He's special." The sergeant nodded, watching the German Shepherd one last time before getting in the car. "He's not just special. He's a hero." With the house quiet again, Jack began removing the makeshift traps and security cameras he'd set up. Margaret, still holding the phone, looked at Max and Jack with tears in her eyes. "You saved my life tonight. I don't know how to thank you." Jack shook his head. "No need to thank us, Margaret. Max and I just did what was right." And as he prepared to leave, Margaret realized she wasn't alone anymore. She had Max, her faithful protector, and now also a new friend in Jack. The following morning brought a quiet relief to Margaret. The sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating the remnants of the battle from the night before. Overturned chairs, a broken window latch, and papers scattered around. Max lay next to his owner, his eyes half closed but alert, as if still ready to react to any threat. Margaret gently stroked his head. "You're my hero, Max," she said with a tired smile, feeling safer than ever before. Soon after, Jack returned to check on Margaret. He brought bags with reinforcements for the house locks and tools to help with the repairs. "Good morning," he said as he entered. "I hope you managed to get some sleep." Margaret chuckled softly. "With Max by my side, it was easier than I thought." Jack looked at the German Shepherd, who responded by wagging his tail. "He doesn't just protect Margaret. He's loyal to the end," Jack remarked as he began working on the windows. As they worked together, Margaret took the opportunity to learn more about Max's past. Jack shared stories of the missions he and Max had completed, from search and rescue operations to dangerous missions against armed criminals. "He was more than a partner. He was my family," Jack said, a melancholic gleam in his eyes. Margaret realized how much Max had meant to him. "It must have been hard to lose him, to think he hadn't survived," she commented. Jack nodded. "It was like losing a part of me. But now I see that he found the place where he was meant to be." As they were talking, Margaret couldn't help but wonder how Max had survived during that year before finding her. "Do you think he still misses that life?" she asked, looking at Max, who seemed so comfortable here with her. Jack smiled. "Max is a service dog, Margaret. He feels like he needs a mission. But with you, he found something different. A home. I think that's more than he could ever ask for." Outside, some neighbors started to appear, curious about the events of the previous night. Mrs. Baker, who lived next door, called out to Margaret from the fence. "Margaret, I saw the police last night. Is everything okay?" Margaret went to the door to talk. "It was a long night," she answered with a sigh. "But Max took care of everything." The neighbor looked at the dog with admiration. "He's really special," she commented. The small group of neighbors gathered around, listening to the story and praising Max's courage. By late morning, after the repairs were done, Jack sat beside Margaret once more. "You're strong, Margaret. Much stronger than you think," he said, as she poured 2 cups of tea. "With Max by my side, I think I can face anything," she replied. And for the first time in many years, Margaret felt something she thought she had lost. A true sense of safety and belonging. With the repairs completed and the thieves captured, Margaret's life began to return to normal, but in a transformed way. Max's presence had become a constant source of comfort and security, and the events of the past few nights made Margaret realize something important. She was no longer the solitary woman she once thought she was. Max had brought a new perspective to her life, and with Jack's help, she felt more connected to the community around her. Jack started visiting Margaret regularly, creating an informal routine of companionship and support. He always brought something useful: groceries, tools, or, on one special occasion, a new ID tag for Max. which included Margaret's name and address. "Now he's officially yours," Jack said, handing over the gift. Margaret smiled, touched. "I feel like he always has been." "Thank you, Jack." Meanwhile, Max seemed to relax more with each passing day, though he still kept his instincts sharp. He began exploring the yard more often, playing with the toys Margaret bought for him. Still, at the slightest strange noise or unexpected visitor, he would instantly assume a protective stance, showing that his loyalty had not wavered. Margaret watched all of this with a mix of pride and affection. The story of the heroic German Shepherd and the invasion of Margaret's house spread quickly through the neighborhood. Soon, Max became something of a local celebrity. Children and adults would walk by the fence, calling for him and asking permission to pet him. Margaret, once seen as a reclusive woman, was now constantly visited by neighbors eager to hear more about her experience. For her, this brought a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in a long time. However, Margaret knew that life was also full of changes and possibilities. In one of their conversations, Jack revealed that he was thinking about going back to work, perhaps in a more administrative role at the police department. "Taking care of you and Max reminded me how much I liked protecting people," he confessed. Margaret nodded, understanding his desire to return to an important part of his life. "You're a protector, Jack. And not just for me," she said with a gentle smile. With Jack reevaluating his future and Max fully integrated into his new life, Margaret began to plan small changes of her own. She decided to participate in community events and even accepted an invitation to a local book club meeting. For the first time in years, she felt like she was rebuilding her life, and Max was at the heart of that transformation. She petted the dog and whispered, "You didn't just save my life, Max. You gave me a new one." The days that followed brought peace to Margaret and Max. Their routine was now filled with small moments of happiness, from morning walks around the neighborhood to encounters with neighbors who always stopped to greet the famous dog. Margaret felt more alive than ever, and Max's constant presence was a daily reminder of how life can change unexpectedly. Sometimes, for the better. On a sunny afternoon, Jack showed up with a special gift. A simple wooden plaque, carefully carved with the inscription "Home of Max, the hero." He handed it to Margaret with a smile. "I think this sums up what this place means now," he said. With tears in her eyes, Margaret hugged him tightly to thank him. The plaque was immediately placed at the entrance of the house, where everyone who passed by could see it. Despite the calm, Margaret knew that Max still carried traces of his previous life as a police dog. In a moment of introspection, as she watched him play in the yard, she wondered if he missed that routine of action and danger. But when Max ran to her, wagging his tail and with a look that seemed to overflow with affection, she knew he was exactly where he wanted to be. He had chosen this home and this life by her side. Jack, who was now more involved in community life, continued to support Margaret and Max whenever possible. Although he was planning to return to the police force, he promised that his friendship with Margaret and his bond with Max would remain intact. "We're a team, Margaret. We always will be," he said during one of his visits. She smiled, feeling a new sense of trust and belonging. "Yes, Jack, and Max is our link." The neighbors, who had once barely known who Margaret was, now treated her as an essential part of the community. They helped reinforce her house, bringing tools and even organizing a small event to honor Max. On the day of the celebration, Margaret watched proudly as the children played with the dog, and Jack told stories about the impressive training he had received. For Margaret, this was the kind of joy she never expected to experience again. That night, as the sun set, Margaret sat on her porch with Max by her side. She looked at the horizon, feeling the warmth of a life well lived and the comfort of safety beside her protector. "You've saved my life more than once, Max," she said, gently stroking his head. "And I promise I'll take care of you for the rest of yours." The German Shepherd lifted his head, as if understanding every word, and wagged his tail. And so, surrounded by peaceful silence and new hope, they continued together, ready to face whatever life brought. And so ends the story of Max and Margaret. If you were moved by this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Share it with your friends, and see you in the next video.